The frigid air bit at Captain Stone's exposed skin, but a colder dread gripped her heart. 1,000 lives hung in the balance, and Command's order was clear: abandon them. Would you pull the trigger on your own career to save strangers? The frigid air bit at Captain Kaelen Stone's exposed skin, but a colder dread gripped her heart. 1,000 lives hung in the balance, and Command's order was clear: abandon them. Would you pull the trigger on your own career to save strangers? Below, in the winding chasm of the Serpent's Coil Canyon, the Ironclad Battalion was trapped. 6 hours earlier, they had marched into an ambush. Intelligence had promised a cleared zone, a safe passage through the northern peaks. Intelligence had been a lie. The enemy had waited, patient as the encroaching winter, allowing the column to stretch thin, a brittle line in the desolate landscape, before closing the trap. Now, 1,000 souls, maybe more, were scattered across the frozen canyon floor, reduced to desperate figures in a board game already lost. Their shallow fighting positions, carved from the permafrost, offered meager cover. The biting wind carried the metallic scent of fear and the distant, rhythmic thud of enemy patrols. The radio, after hours of strained static and desperate calls, had fallen silent just before dawn. No air support. The blizzard-like conditions had grounded every rotor and wing. No artillery. The canyon's depth placed them beyond the range of their distant fire base. No rescue. Command had already marked them as acceptable losses, a grim footnote in a larger strategic calculus. Think about the pressure on those trapped Marines digging into the rock, their entrenching tools sparking in the dark. Imagine the taste of the frigid air, thick with the smell of wet earth and impending death. They were preparing for the inevitable assault, an enemy doctrine as old as war itself: strike with the first light of dawn. Perched on a distant ridgeline, Captain Kaelen Spectre Stone pressed the frigid scope of her rifle against her eye socket. The valley floor was a miniature tableau of despair 3,000 yards below. Beside her, separated by 40 feet of jagged rock, Lieutenant Rhiannon Stone, her twin, held an identical vigil. For 72 hours, they had been the eyes of advanced reconnaissance, silent predators on the high ground, feeding intelligence back to Command. They had done their job. They had reported everything. And still, the battalion had walked into hell. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. The radio in Kaelen's pack crackled, a distant voice breaking through layers of atmosphere and desperation. "All sniper teams, this is Overwatch Command. Execute Omega Protocol. I say again, execute Omega Protocol. Withdraw to extraction point Echo. Acknowledge." Omega Protocol. The emergency withdrawal order. No questions, no delays, no exceptions. Kaelen's finger hovered over the transmit button. Around the sprawling northern peaks, other sniper teams, she knew, were already packing their gear, already moving through the pre-dawn dark toward safety. Omega Protocol meant the situation was hopeless. It meant cutting losses. It meant everyone who could leave should leave. Kaelen looked at her sister. Rhiannon was already looking back, her eyes glinting in the faint pre-dawn gloom. Through her scope, Kaelen saw a young Marine, no older than 19, trying to deepen his inadequate hole. The sound of his entrenching tool scraping against permafrost was a tiny, desperate sound across the vast distance. Beads of sweat stung his eyes, even in the bitter cold. He was crying, she could see that, even from 3,000 yards. Crying and digging and waiting for a dawn he wouldn't survive. "We have to acknowledge," Kaelen said, her voice a low rasp that formed fleeting clouds in the air. Rhiannon didn't answer immediately. Her shallow breathing was the only sound. Kaelen knew what her sister was doing, calculating. Angles, distances, wind speed, temperature gradients. the cold mathematics of life and death. "They'll die," Rhiannon finally stated, her voice edged with a primal certainty. "All of them. By 700, that valley becomes a graveyard. Protocol is protocol, but protocol is written by people who aren't watching." Kaelen closed her eyes. 12 years in the Corps, Rhiannon 11. 3 deployments, countless missions. Never once had they broken protocol. That discipline, that unwavering adherence, was the invisible backbone of everything they were. Now, protocol meant death. Just not their death. "If we stay," Kaelen murmured, the metallic tang of adrenaline already in her mouth, "we face court-martial, end of career. Maybe worse. If we leave, we face ourselves for the rest of our lives." What would you do in this silence, with the weight of that moral dilemma crushing you? Down in the canyon, the young Marine had stopped digging. He sat with his back against his meager cover, rifle across his knees, staring east where the first hints of gray were beginning to bleed into the black sky. Kaelen's decision solidified. Her hand moved with a chilling finality. Click. The small LED on her radio, which had glowed green for 72 hours, went dark. With it went her career, her future, perhaps her freedom. Rhiannon watched her sister's hand, then reached for her own radio. Click. Darkness. Silence. "To positions," Rhiannon commanded, her voice calm, devoid of doubt. "Maximum separation. Overlapping fields of fire. You take the southern approach. I'll cover north. Conserve ammunition. Shoot command structure only. Make every shot count." They had worked together for so long that planning was instantaneous, a silent language of glances and gestures. A shared womb before a shared battlefield. Some connections ran deeper than doctrine. Rhiannon began to crawl backward, a shadow melting into the rocky ridgeline, leaving Kaelen alone with the rising dawn. Kaelen adjusted her scope. The enemy, hidden beyond the valley rim, was shifting. She caught glimpses, a careless silhouette against snowpack, the glint of cold steel. They were confident. They had numbers. They had position. They had time. They did not know about the 2 sisters on the ridge. The eastern sky began its slow transition from black to a bruised purple, then pearl. Somewhere behind enemy lines, officers would be checking watches, reviewing attack plans, preparing their forces for the final assault, moving with dawn because that's when defenders were most exhausted, most demoralized. Kaelen settled into her position, regulating her breathing until it was a shallow, steady rhythm. She became part of the rock, part of the ice, part of the brutal wind itself. Through her scope, she found her first target, an enemy officer, 3,200 yards distant, moving between positions with the confident swagger of someone beyond reach. Authority in his posture, command in his gestures. Kaelen adjusted for wind, for temperature, for the subtle curve of the earth itself at this extreme distance. Her finger found the trigger. The young Marine in the valley was standing now, a solitary figure, rifle in hand, waiting for the light that would bring his death. Kaelen exhaled slowly, her heart a steady drum against her ribs, and waited for her sister to be ready. Because when they started this, there would be no stopping, no second chances, no way back. The silence wasn't just broken, it was shattered. The rifle spoke, a sharp, concussive crack that ripped through the pre-dawn stillness. The bullet took 3.7 seconds to travel 3,200 yards. In that agonizing stretch of time, the enemy officer below shifted slightly, a fractional movement that changed everything. The round struck 2 inches lower than Kaelen had aimed, tearing into his throat instead of his head. Through the scope, she watched him crumple, a sudden, horrifying collapse. A dark spray, stark against the burgeoning light, erupted from his neck as soldiers around him scattered, diving for cover, their panic palpable even at this distance. They had been preparing to attack. Now, they were the ones under fire, from an unseen enemy. 2 seconds later, another officer fell on the southern approach. Rhiannon's shot, a textbook center mass, echoed across the canyon. The enemy forces erupted into chaos. Officers barked frantic orders at an invisible threat. Soldiers scanned the ridgelines with the desperate movements of cornered prey. 3 commanders down in 90 seconds. No one knew how many snipers they faced. No one knew where the shots were coming from. No one wanted to be the 4th officer to die. The very air seemed to crackle with their fear. Kaelen worked her bolt, the spent casing ejecting with a metallic ping that was instantly swallowed by the wind. She chambered another round, her eyes already scanning for her next target before the brass hit stone. Sniper doctrine was clear. 1 shot, 1 kill, then relocate. Never fire twice from the same position. The enemy would triangulate muzzle flashes, call in mortars or counter-sniper teams. You would die in the hole you were too stubborn to leave. But doctrine assumed you had somewhere to relocate to. It assumed you valued survival over mission. It assumed you weren't trying to save 1,000 Marines with less than 100 bullets. Kaelen stayed put. She found her second target, a platoon leader, his face grim, trying to rally his troops, pointing toward the canyon floor. He was good, restoring a semblance of order. That made him a problem. She shot him through the chest. He fell backward, and the soldiers he'd been directing scattered again, their nascent resolve crumbling. The chaos, now a living thing, spread like ripples across a pond. Rhiannon fired again from the south. Kaelen couldn't see the target, but she recognized the rhythm, steady, methodical, making every round count. Down in the canyon, the trapped Marines were stirring. Kaelen could see them pointing, watching the disruption spread through the enemy lines. They didn't know what was happening, but they knew the attack hadn't come yet. That, in itself, was a flicker of hope where none had existed before. A new sound reached Kaelen's ears, a distant, garbled crackle on the enemy's tactical net. She'd carried a scanner preset to common frequencies. The voice was frantic, speaking in a language she didn't need to translate. They were reporting snipers, multiple snipers, long-range precision fire, leadership casualties. Good. Let them believe in multiples. Let them believe they faced an entire platoon of ghosts, instead of 2 women with a death wish. Kaelen shifted her aim to the eastern approach. The sun was nearly up, painting the horizon in shades of amber and gold. A beautiful morning for dying, or for defying death. She found a cluster of soldiers preparing a heavy machine gun, its metallic glint catching the first light. This weapon, once online, could shred the Ironclad Battalion below. The crew worked efficiently: gunner, assistant gunner, ammunition handler. Kaelen shot the gunner first. He collapsed across the weapon. The assistant gunner reached for him, trying to pull him away, and Rhiannon's rifle spoke from the south. The assistant gunner crumpled. The ammunition handler looked around wildly, then abandoned the gun and ran. Smart choice. 4 minutes to sunrise. The enemy was supposed to be attacking. Instead, they were pinned, disoriented by an invisible threat they couldn't locate or suppress. But they had resources Kaelen and Rhiannon didn't. Moments after the machine gun crew went down, Kaelen heard a new, ominous sound. The distinctive whomp-whomp of mortars being deployed. They weren't targeting the canyon anymore. They were targeting the ridgeline. The first mortar round landed 300 yards south of Kaelin's position. Too far to be dangerous, but close enough to show they were guessing. The second round landed closer, 200 yards. They were walking fire along the ridgeline, trying to flush the snipers out, or kill them through saturation. Kaelin didn't move. Movement would give away her position more surely than staying still. She pressed herself flat against the rock, the cold seeping into her bones, and kept shooting. A squad leader organizing his troops, gone. A soldier with a radio, likely a forward observer calling in those mortars, gone. A fighter trying to drag a wounded comrade to safety. Kaelin hesitated. Shooting wounded, or those rendering aid, violated the rules of warfare. But he was also carrying a rifle, also part of the enemy force, and she couldn't afford mercy when 1,000 Marines were depending on her bullets. She shot him in the leg. Not lethal, but enough to take him out of the fight. A compromise with her conscience, a burning coal in her gut. The mortars were getting closer. Rhiannon would be facing the same problem. They couldn't stay in these positions much longer, but they couldn't leave either. Moving meant losing the angles, losing the effectiveness, losing the illusion that the ridgeline was filled with defenders. Kaelin made a decision. She switched her radio back on. Not to Overwatch Command, that bridge was burned, but to the Ironclad Battalion's tactical frequency. She keyed the microphone and spoke quietly, calmly, with the voice of someone in complete control, even though her breath hitched in her throat. Any Marine receiving this transmission, this is Spectre Overwatch. You have snapper support on the ridgeline. Maintain your positions. Help is coming. Sunrise protocol is in effect. Acknowledge if you copy. Silence hung heavy for 3 agonizing seconds. Then a voice, young and cracking with raw emotion, cut through the static. Spectre Overwatch, this is Ironclad Battalion Actual. We copy. We thought we were alone. Kaelin's throat tightened. You're not alone, Battalion. Hold your positions. Make them pay for every yard. We've got your back. Who are you? The voice rasped. Ghosts, Kaelin said, and turned the radio back off. She went back to shooting. The mortars were landing in a predictable pattern now, walking north along the ridgeline. They would reach her position in the next salvo. She could stay and die, or move and break the illusion. Rhiannon made the choice for her. Another shot from the south, but this one wasn't aimed at enemy troops. It was aimed at the mortar position itself. 3,500 yards. Extreme range. Shooting at a target she could probably barely see. The round hit one of the mortar tubes dead center. Kaelin didn't know if Rhiannon had been aiming for the tube or the crew, but the effect was spectacular. The mortar round that had been loaded detonated, and the entire position went up in a cascade of secondary explosions. The mortar fire stopped. Kaelin allowed herself a tight, grim smile. That was Rhiannon. When Doctrine said, hide and wait, she said, attack the problem directly. The sun broke the horizon, painting the canyon floor in golden light. 1,000 Marines, battered, exhausted, probably low on ammunition, had survived to see it. The attack that was supposed to come with dawn hadn't. Instead, the enemy was reorganizing, taking casualties, trying to figure out how to fight an opponent they couldn't see. Kaelin scanned the valley rim. She counted at least 30 bodies, enemy soldiers and officers who would never see another sunset. Rhiannon had probably accounted for another 15 or 20 on the southern approach. 45 enemy down, 49 rounds expended between them. 955 enemy fighters remaining. 45 rounds left. The mathematics still didn't work, but the psychology was shifting. The enemy had been confident, certain of victory. Now they were afraid. Fear was a weapon more powerful than any bullet. Through her scope, Kaelen saw something that made her heart sink, then surge with a different kind of dread and hope. Vehicles, large and heavy, were moving toward the valley from the east. Not enemy reinforcements. These were different, larger, moving in the distinctive pattern of a mechanized column. For one terrible moment, she thought Command had sent armor to finish what the ambush started. Then she recognized the profiles. American vehicles. Reinforcements for the Marines below. Someone had countermanded the Omega Protocol, or the Ironclad Battalion's situation had shifted priority. Some officer, somewhere, had decided 1,000 lives were worth the risk after all. Help was coming. Real help. With armor and infantry and all the resources Kaelen and Rhiannon didn't have. They had bought enough time. The Marines would survive. Kaelen keyed her radio one final time. Ironclad Battalion, Spectre Overwatch. Armor column approaching from east. ETA 15 minutes. Hold position and prepare for friendly arrival. Spectre Overwatch, we copy. Thank you. Whoever you are, thank you. Kaelen didn't respond. She saved her rifle and began the process of withdrawing from her position. Rhiannon would be doing the same from the south. They needed to be gone before the reinforcements arrived, before anyone asked questions about who had been providing sniper support. They had saved 1,000 Marines. In doing so, they had ended their careers. The long, brutal journey to escape their own hunters begins now. The withdrawal took hours, a slow, grinding torture of muscle and mind. Kaelen moved like smoke across the ridgeline, using every depression and shadow to mask her movement. The enemy was still out there, still dangerous, still hunting for the snipers who had devastated their attack. She covered 3 miles in 4 hours, a pace dictated by caution, not speed. Rhiannon paralleled her route on the southern slope, a silent partner in their desperate ballet of evasion. Their initial insertion planning, those meticulous contingencies for exfiltration routes and coded rally points, were now keeping them alive. The terrain was brutal. Frozen scree shifted under every step, threatening to betray their presence. Ice sheets, thin and treacherous, could send them sliding down a cliff face into oblivion. A wind that seemed to cut through gear and skin like a blade clawed at them. Kaelen's hands were numb despite her gloves. Her face burned with cold despite the scarf wrapped tightly around it. She moved anyway, stopping only when absolutely necessary, using her scope to scan ahead before committing to each new section of ground. This was the unseen part of combat, the grinding hours of exhaustion and discomfort, the slow, methodical work of simply staying alive. Behind them, the sounds of battle resumed, a distant rumble that signaled the arrival of armor and infantry. The Ironclad Battalion was being reinforced, the enemy broken and withdrawing. The Serpent's Coil Canyon was being held. Kaelen allowed herself no sense of victory. Victory meant questions. Victory meant investigations. Victory meant someone would want to know who had ignored the Omega Protocol and why. Her stomach clenched at the thought. She reached the first rally point by midday, a cluster of rocks forming a natural shelter, marked on their map with coordinates known only to them. Rhiannon wasn't there yet. Kaelen checked her watch. Rhiannon should have arrived 30 minutes ago if she'd moved at a normal pace, 45 if delayed by enemy patrols. An hour passed. Kaelen felt the first touch of real fear, a cold knot tightening in her gut. Rhiannon was never late. Even in training, where timing was less critical, Rhiannon's internal clock was never wrong. If she wasn't here, something had happened. Kaelen forced herself to think tactically. Rhiannon could be pinned down, injured, or taking an alternate route for reasons Kaelen couldn't know. Moving to search for her meant exposing herself, risking both of them, possibly creating a crisis where none existed. She waited another hour, using the time to strip and clean her rifle, check her remaining ammunition, eat cold rations from her pack. Professional habits to keep panic at bay, to quell the tremor in her hands. Then her radio crackled, a barely audible whisper. Rhiannon's voice. "North route compromised. Taking South Ridge. 2 hours." Kaelen exhaled, a long, slow breath of relief. "Copy. See you soon." The transmission ended, short and coded, using terms that would sound like static to anyone scanning frequencies. Rhiannon was alive, moving, delayed but not in immediate danger. Kaelen settled in to wait. The sun tracked across the sky, the temperature rising from brutal to merely bitter. In the distance, she could see helicopters moving over the canyon, medevac birds extracting wounded, cargo birds bringing in supplies. The Ironclad Battalion was being taken care of. The system was working, now that someone in command had decided they were worth saving. Rhiannon appeared exactly 2 hours later, materializing from the rocks like she had been born from stone. She looked utterly exhausted, her face wind-burned, eyes red-rimmed, moving with the careful precision of someone at the absolute end of their reserves. "Ran into a patrol," Rhiannon said quietly, dropping her pack with a weary sigh. "Had to detour 5 miles east." "Contact?" Kaelen asked, her voice tight. "Avoided. Hid in a crevasse for an hour while they searched." Rhiannon pulled out her water bottle, taking a long, shaky drink. "They're looking hard. We hurt them." "We saved them," Kaelen corrected, the words tasting of copper. "Same thing, depending on perspective." Rhiannon sat down heavily, the soft thud of her gear bag against the rock echoing in the quiet. "What's the plan?" Kaelen had been thinking about that for hours. "Command knows someone stayed behind. They'll investigate. They'll find evidence, shell casings, disturbance patterns, ballistics. Eventually they'll figure out it was us." "How long?" Rhiannon asked, her gaze fixed on the distant peaks. "Days. Maybe a week if we're lucky." Rhiannon nodded. She had known this was coming. Both of them had. "Court-martial?" "Best case scenario. Worst case, they make an example." Kaelen listed the charges like an inventory of their sins. Dereliction of duty during combat operations, refusing direct orders, operating outside chain of command. She stared at the desolate landscape, the cold wind whipping strands of hair across her face. "We could be looking at years in military prison." "Worth it," Rhiannon said without hesitation. Kaelen looked at her sister, truly looked at her. Rhiannon's eyes held no doubt, only a grim certainty. 1,000 Marines went home. 1,000 Marines saw another sunrise. Yeah, it's worth it. Kaelen wanted to argue, to point out that principle and practicality weren't the same thing, that sacrifice without strategy was just waste. But she couldn't, because she had made the same choice Rhiannon had. She had turned off her radio, knowing exactly what it meant. "We need to get to the extraction point," Kaelen said, the words feeling heavy on her tongue. "Turn ourselves in before they send hunters. Or we disappear." Kaelen stared, the bitter wind stinging her eyes. "What?"
We disappear, Rhiannon repeated, her voice low and steady. We're good at being invisible. We walk away. New identities, new lives.
Let Command think we died on that ridge. Rhiannon, I'm serious. So am I. We've got skills, we've got training. We could survive outside the system. As what? Mercenaries? Criminals? Kaelen shook her head, the movement tight. That's not who we are. No, Rhiannon countered, her voice hardening. We're the people who followed orders until following orders meant watching people die. Then we broke protocol. If we turn ourselves in, Command destroys us to protect the protocol we broke. We become the lesson, the warning, the reason why everyone else has to obey without question. Kaelen had no counter-argument because Rhiannon was right. That was exactly what would happen. The military ran on discipline. If two snipers could pick and choose which orders to follow, the entire structure became negotiable. Dad wouldn't have run, Kaelen said quietly. The memory of their father, Sergeant Major Stone, a phantom weight in the cold air. Dad died following orders. Rhiannon's gaze sharpened. You want that to be our memorial too? They sat in silence, watching the afternoon light paint long, stark shadows across the mountains. Two sisters, two rifles, two diverging visions of what came next. Finally, Kaelen spoke, the words difficult. If we run, we prove them right, that we were reckless, that we put ourselves above the mission, that we can't be trusted. And if we turn ourselves in, we're martyrs to a system that was willing to let 1,000 Marines die because the paperwork said they were acceptable losses. So what do we do? Rhiannon smiled, not with humor, but with the grim recognition of someone who had seen the same problem from every angle. We do what we've always done. We take the shot we can make and deal with the consequences later. The extraction point is 40 miles south, Kaelen said, stating the obvious. Command will have people there. Once we arrive, we're in custody. Then we don't arrive. We find another way. There is no other way. We're in hostile territory, no support, limited supplies. Kaelen checked her ammunition count. I've got 22 rounds left. You? 18. 40 rounds between us against an entire region that wants us dead or captured. Rhiannon shrugged, a faint tremor in her jawline. We faced worse odds. When? Kaelen asked, a wry edge to her voice. This morning, when we decided 2 rifles could save a battalion. Kaelen couldn't help it. She laughed, a short, sharp bark of recognition. Rhiannon was right. They had already committed to the impossible. Everything after that was just details. Okay, Kaelen said, the decision solidifying in her mind. So, we evade. We survive. Then what? Then we get home, back to the States. We tell our story, not to Command, but to everyone. Public, media. Make it impossible for them to bury us quietly. Rhiannon's eyes were bright with the kind of tactical thinking that made her so dangerous. They can court-martial us, but they can't silence us. Not if the whole country knows what happened in that canyon. It was a plan, not a good plan. It had about 100 ways to fail, and maybe 2 ways to succeed. But it was better than surrender, and better than running forever. We'll need to move at night, Kaelen said, already thinking logistics. Avoid population centers. Live off the land as much as possible. I know a route. Rhiannon pulled out a folded map from her jacket. It was marked with pencil lines, notations, alternative paths. Figured we might need a way out someday. You've been planning this? I've been planning for us to have options. There's a difference. Kaelen studied the map. The route Rhiannon had marked took them through some of the roughest terrain in the region: mountain passes, river valleys, areas where even the enemy didn't maintain regular patrols. It would take weeks. It would be brutal. People would be hunting them from multiple directions. But it might work. "When do we move?" Kaelen asked. "Dark. 4 hours. Get some rest. When we start moving, we don't stop until we're clear." Kaelen nodded. She should have felt fear. They were about to become fugitives from their own military while trapped in hostile territory. Instead, she felt something else: purpose, clarity. The same feeling she had felt on the ridgeline when she decided to turn off her radio. Some choices weren't about protocols or consequences. Some choices were about looking at yourself in the mirror for the next 50 years. Kaelen closed her eyes and tried to rest. In 4 hours, they would begin the longest mission of their lives. No support, no backup, no one coming to save them. Just 2 sisters, 40 bullets, and a long walk home. The hunter would soon become the hunted, but the price for freedom was yet unknown. They moved through darkness like water through cracks. Kaelen led the first leg, navigating by terrain, memory, and starlight. No GPS, those signals could be tracked. No radio, same problem. Just old-fashioned land navigation, using the mountains as reference points, and dead reckoning to measure distance. Rhiannon followed 20 yards behind, watching their back trail, ensuring they left minimal sign. They moved in 30-minute increments, then stopped to listen. Listening was the most important skill in evasion. Your ears told you what your eyes couldn't see: distant engines, radio chatter, the distinctive sound of organized movement through rugged terrain. For the first 3 hours, they heard nothing but wind and the ragged rhythm of their own breathing. Then, around midnight, the faint thrum of distant rotors reached them. Helicopters. The sound came from the north. Multiple aircraft. Probably searchbirds with thermal imaging, sweeping the ridgeline where Kaelen and Rhiannon had been positioned, looking for bodies, for evidence, for the snipers who had saved a battalion and then vanished. The metallic taste of adrenaline coated Kaelen's tongue. They pressed themselves into a shallow ravine, covering themselves with loose rock and vegetation. The thermal blankets in their packs would mask their heat signatures, but only if they remained perfectly still. Even the slight warmth of a breath could show up as an anomaly on sensitive equipment. The helicopters passed overhead, their searchlights painting the rocks in harsh, white illumination. Kaelen counted the seconds between sweeps, calculating search patterns. They were being thorough. Someone important wanted answers. After 20 minutes, the helicopters moved on, continuing their grid search to the west. Kaelen and Rhiannon waited another 30 minutes, the cold seeping into their bones, just to be sure. Then, they emerged from cover and kept moving. By dawn, they had covered 12 miles, not fast, but sustainable, and more importantly, they had moved perpendicular to the direction Command would expect. The extraction point was south. They were heading southwest, toward the borderlands of the Forgotten King, where authority became negotiable and the terrain made pursuit difficult. They found shelter in an abandoned shepherd's hut, barely more than stacked stones and a partial roof, but enough to hide them during daylight hours. Rhiannon took first watch while Kaelen tried to sleep. She couldn't. Her mind kept returning to the Serpent's Coil Canyon, to the young Marine who had been digging futilely in the frozen ground. Was he alive? Had the reinforcements arrived in time? Would he ever know who had been on that ridgeline? Probably not. The military would classify the incident. The official record would show that the battalion was reinforced by conventional forces, that casualties were acceptable, that protocol was followed. The sisters who had defied orders to save them would become a footnote, if they were mentioned at all. Unless they made it home. Unless they told the story themselves. Kaelen drifted into an uneasy sleep, her hands still wrapped around her rifle, the cold, gritty earth a hard bed beneath her. Rhiannon woke her 4 hours later. Movement, east, maybe 3 miles. Kaelen was instantly alert, the lingering taste of sleep replaced by the metallic tang of immediate danger. What kind? Foot patrol. Sounds organized. Could be ours, could be theirs. Either way, we don't want contact. They packed quickly and moved deeper into the northern peaks. The terrain was working against them now. The higher they climbed, the more exposed they became. But exposure was better than capture. They traveled for 6 more hours, stopping frequently to check their back trail. The patrol Rhiannon had heard never appeared. Maybe it had turned back. Maybe it was still searching. Maybe it was coordinating with other units, setting up a net. By nightfall, they had gained another 15 miles, 27 total. A marathon distance under normal conditions. In mountains, with full gear, while evading pursuit, it was exceptional. It was also unsustainable. They couldn't maintain this pace for weeks. "We need to find supplies," Rhiannon said during their night halt, her voice rough with exhaustion. "Water especially. We're down to half a canteen each." Kaelen knew. They had passed several streams, but water in this region was questionable without purification. They had tablets, but a limited supply. Food was also becoming an issue. Their rations would last maybe 4 more days if they rationed carefully. "There's a village," Kaelen said, checking her map. 20 miles south-southwest. Remote. Probably not worth military attention. Could buy supplies. "With what currency? We've got American dollars and military script. Both will mark us as foreign." Rhiannon pulled out a small pouch from her pack. Inside were gold coins, local currency from their initial insertion, meant for emergency use with informants. Maybe $50 worth in total. "Emergency enough?" Rhiannon asked, her eyes meeting Kaelen's in the dim light. Kaelen nodded. "We go in separately. You buy food. I buy water and supplies. Meet at the northern checkpoint, 1 hour maximum. And if one of us doesn't make it out, the other keeps moving." Kaelen said it matter-of-factly, but the words tasted like ash. The thought of continuing without Rhiannon was unbearable, but sentiment was a luxury they couldn't afford. They reached the village around midnight. It was small, maybe 30 buildings, mostly dark. A few lights showed in windows. Somewhere, a dog barked at shadows. Rhiannon went first. She had a gift for blending in, for moving through spaces without drawing attention. Kaelen watched from a distance as her sister entered a small shop that was still open, probably serving locals who worked night shifts or travelers passing through. Kaelen approached from the other side, finding a different shop. The proprietor was an old man, half asleep behind his counter. She used hand gestures and her limited language skills to purchase water bottles, dried fruit, bread. The man barely looked at her, taking the coins and making change with the automatic motions of someone who had done this transaction 1,000 times. She was back on the street in 10 minutes. Rhiannon emerged from her shop 5 minutes later. They met at the northern edge of the village, exchanged nods, and kept walking. It wasn't until they were a mile clear that Rhiannon spoke. "Someone was asking about Americans." Kaelen's hand tightened on her rifle, the cold steel digging into her palm. "In the shop?" "Outside. I heard it through the window. Man asking if anyone had seen foreign soldiers offering money." "Bounty hunters," Kaelen murmured, the word a bitter taste in her mouth. Or intelligence gathering. Either way, someone knows we're in the region. They picked up their pace. The village had been a risk, but a necessary one. Now it was a marker on the map that would tell their pursuers which direction to search. For 3 more days, they moved through the mountains, climbing, descending, following ridgelines and stream beds, avoiding roads and settlements, living off the supplies they had bought and whatever they could forage. On the 4th day, they heard helicopters again, closer this time. The search pattern had shifted. Whoever was hunting them had adjusted their search radius. "They found something," Kaelen said, her voice tight. "A track, sign we left, something." "Or they're guessing better than we're evading," Rhiannon countered. That night, they made a decision. Instead of continuing southwest toward the border, they would turn directly south, then loop east. A longer route, but one that would take them through terrain too rough for helicopters to search effectively. It added a week to their journey, maybe 2. They would run out of supplies. They would have to risk another village or find another source. But they would be alive. The 5th day, the weather turned. Snow began falling, light at first, then heavy. Visibility dropped to yards. Temperature plummeted. It was the kind of storm that killed unprepared travelers. Kaelen and Rhiannon had trained in worse. They used the storm as cover, pushing through conditions that would ground helicopters and halt foot patrols. They covered 20 miles in 18 hours, leaving tracks that would be erased by snowfall within minutes. When the storm finally broke, they were 40 miles from where the search had focused. They had gained breathing room, but Kaelen knew it wouldn't last. Someone wanted them badly enough to commit extensive resources. Command didn't chase ghosts unless those ghosts represented a profound problem, and 2 snipers who had ignored the Omega Protocol were definitely a problem. The question was, how much of a problem? And how far would Command go to solve it? They found the abandoned military outpost on day 9. It sat on a ridge overlooking a narrow valley, one of dozens of positions that had been built during earlier conflicts and then left to decay when the wars moved elsewhere. The walls were crumbling, the roof mostly collapsed, but the foundation was sound, and the location gave them a commanding view of the terrain below. More importantly, it had a cache. Every outpost maintained supply caches, hidden stores of ammunition, medical supplies, rations. The military rarely recovered them during withdrawals. Too much effort, too little value. But for 2 fugitives running on empty supplies, a cache was salvation. Rhiannon found it under a loose stone in what had been the communications room, a metal container, sealed and buried, untouched for years. Inside, 6 boxes of ammunition matching their rifles, field dressings, water purification tablets, and a dozen MREs that were probably expired but still edible. "Someone's looking out for us," Rhiannon said, a rare, faint smile touching her lips as she checked dates on the ammunition. "Or we're just lucky," Kaelen replied. But she felt it too, a sense that the universe, in its own grim way, was conspiring to keep them moving forward. They spent the night in the outpost, taking turns on watch. Kaelen took the 2nd shift, keeping vigil in the pre-dawn hours when attacks were most likely. She watched the valley below, scanning for movement, for lights, for any indication they had been followed. Nothing. Just wind and darkness and the distant cry of a night bird. When Rhiannon relieved her at dawn, Kaelen finally allowed herself to think beyond immediate survival. They had made it nearly 100 miles. They were approaching the borderlands of the Forgotten King, not an official border with checkpoints and customs, but the fuzzy zone where one country's authority faded and another's hadn't quite taken hold. If they could reach that zone, they could find people who didn't care about military protocols. smugglers, traders, fixers who moved people and goods across borders for the right price. With the remaining gold coins, and possibly their weapons as barter, they might be able to arrange transport to somewhere safer. From there, it was a matter of finding an embassy, making contact with sympathetic journalists, telling their story before command could bury it. It was a long shot, but all their shots had been long. "Thinking loud," Rhiannon said, settling in beside her, the smell of cold rock and damp earth clinging to her. "About home. About what happens if we make it." "When we make it," Kaelen corrected, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "When, right. You having doubts?" "I'm having realism. We broke every rule. We're going to pay for that, even if we tell our story." "Maybe. But we'll pay on our terms, not theirs." Rhiannon checked the valley below. "You know what Dad used to say about consequences?" "Which quote? He had about 100. "The one about owning your choices. He said the worst thing a Marine could do wasn't make a mistake. It was make a mistake and then pretend someone else was responsible." Rhiannon glanced at her sister. "We're owning this. All of it. That counts for something." Kaelen nodded. It did count. Maybe not in a court-martial, but in the internal ledger they would both carry forever. They moved out at mid-morning, leaving the outpost as empty as they'd found it. The cache had extended their timeline. They could push for another week, maybe 2, before supplies became critical again. The terrain was changing. The high mountains were giving way to foothills, which would eventually flatten into the border plains. Easier travel, but less cover. They would need to be more careful. On day 11, they encountered people. A small group, 6 or 7 individuals, traveling on foot with pack animals. Not military, probably traders or nomads moving goods between regions that didn't show up on official maps. Kaelen and Rhiannon watched from a distance, trying to decide. These people might have information. They might have supplies to trade. They might also have radios, might be willing to report foreign soldiers for a reward. "Your call," Rhiannon said quietly, the low rumble of her voice almost swallowed by the wind. Kaelen studied the group through her scope. Their body language was relaxed. They weren't moving tactically. They stopped to rest, to water their animals, to share food. Just people trying to make a living in a hard land. "We approach openly," Kaelen decided, the words a challenge to the gnawing fear in her stomach. "Weapons visible, but not threatening. See if they'll trade." They moved down from their observation position, making noise deliberately so they wouldn't appear to be ambushing. The traders spotted them immediately, went tense, reached for whatever weapons they carried, then saw it was just 2 women, alone, moving without aggression. The leader stepped forward. He was old, maybe 60, with the kind of weathered face that came from decades under harsh sun. He spoke in the local language, which Kaelen barely understood. She replied in slow, careful phrases. "We seek trade. Food for gold." The old man studied them. His eyes lingered on their rifles, on their gear, on the way they carried themselves. He knew what they were. The question was whether he cared. He named a price, outrageous, 3 times what the supplies were worth. Kaelen countered. The old man laughed, a dry, raspy sound, and came down slightly. They settled on a price that was still too high, but survivable. Kaelen handed over coins. The old man produced dried meat, flatbread, cheese wrapped in cloth. Real food, not military rations. As they were concluding the trade, the old man spoke again. Kaelen caught only part of it, but the meaning was clear. "Helicopters search for someone. Many helicopters, many soldiers. You are careful." "Yes," Kaelen nodded, her throat suddenly dry. Yes, careful. The old man smiled, showing gaps in his teeth. Then he said something else, and this time his meaning was unmistakable. The canyon battle. We hear stories. 2 women save many soldiers. He touched his chest in a gesture of respect. Allah watches over the brave. He knew. Kaelen felt Rhiannon tense beside her shallow breathing quickening. 1 word to authorities, 1 radio call, and this would end. They were at this man's mercy. The old man turned and spoke sharply to his group. They resumed packing, preparing to move on. Then he looked back at Kaelen and Rhiannon. We see nothing. We go west. You go. He gestured vaguely. Wherever you must go, travel safe. He walked away without waiting for a response. His group followed, and within minutes they were distant specks moving across the landscape. He knew, Rhiannon said quietly, and said nothing. Kaelen watched the traitors disappear, because maybe some stories matter more than rewards. Maybe he lost people in these wars and respects anyone who tried to save others. Or maybe the old man simply didn't care about conflicts between foreign powers. Either way, he had given them something more valuable than food. He had given them the knowledge that not everyone would hunt them. They continued south. 3 days later, they reached the borderlands. There were no signs, no fences, no official markers. But Kaelen could sense the change in the land, in the settlements, in the way people moved. This was the margin, the edge, the place where rules loosened and survival trumped ideology. They found a small town that existed primarily to service the gray market. Goods moved through here that couldn't move through official channels. People passed through who couldn't pass through official borders. Kaelen and Rhiannon needed exactly that kind of passage. They found a fixer in a tea house, a woman in her 40s, missing 2 fingers on her left hand, who conducted business in a back room filled with smoke and quiet conversations. Kaelen explained what they needed in simple terms. Transport across the border. No questions. Cash payment. The woman quoted a price that would take every coin they had, plus their ammunition. No ammunition, Kaelen said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her gut. We keep our weapons. The woman shrugged, her eyes unreadable. Then no transport. Ammunition is valuable. Your rifles without bullets are just expensive clubs. Rhiannon caught Kaelen's eye. They had a brief conversation in glances and minimal gestures. They had come too far to fail here. The ammunition was insurance, but it was insurance they might never need if they could just cross this last barrier. The ultimate betrayal. They must surrender their ammunition, leaving them vulnerable to a final, unknown threat. Agreed, Kaelen said, her voice a tight knot of resignation and resolve. But we keep the rifles. The fixer nodded, her eyes glinting in the dim light of the back room. 3 days. There is a truck convoy leaving for the south. You ride in container with cargo. Uncomfortable, maybe dangerous. But you cross border and no one asks questions. How dangerous? Rhiannon asked, her voice low. Checkpoints sometimes search containers. If that happens, you are not our problem. You hide well, or you face consequences. Kaelen and Rhiannon exchanged another look. They had faced worse odds. We'll be ready, Kaelen said. The woman collected their ammunition and half their remaining gold coins. The rest would be paid upon delivery. As they left the tea house, Kaelen felt lighter. Not physically, they had just traded away 2/3 of their combat capability, but mentally. This was the final obstacle. 3 days, and they would be across the border, beyond the immediate reach of military pursuit, free to find their way home. 3 days. They found an abandoned building to shelter in, a burned-out shell that had once been a warehouse. They took turns sleeping, conserving energy, preparing mentally for the final push. On the second night, Rhiannon spoke into the darkness. "What do you think happens after we tell our story?" Kaelen stared at the crumbling ceiling, the cold night air biting at her exposed skin. "Honestly, I don't know. Court-martial, probably. Maybe prison time. Maybe just discharge. Worth it?" Kaelen thought about the young Marine in the Serpent's Coil Canyon, about the 1,000 lives that had seen another sunrise, about the principle that some orders were meant to be questioned. "Yeah," she said, the word a quiet affirmation. "Worth it." They waited for the third day, for the truck, for the journey that would take them home. The truck arrived before dawn, exactly as promised. It was a commercial transport, old, diesel-powered, carrying legal cargo in the front containers and less legal materials in the hidden compartments. The driver barely acknowledged Kaelen and Rhiannon, simply pointing to a panel in the truck's side that opened to reveal a space maybe 6 feet by 4 feet by 3 feet tall. "You fit," the driver said in broken English. "You stay quiet. No move when truck stops. We tell you when is safe." Kaelen and Rhiannon climbed in. The space was smaller than advertised, cramped and airless. They had to lie on their sides, pressed against cargo crates that smelled of engine oil and something organic that had probably rotted months ago. The panel closed, plunging them into absolute darkness. The truck started moving. Kaelen tried to track time and direction by feel, counting turns, estimating speed. But after an hour, her sense of orientation was completely scrambled. She had no idea if they were going south, west, or in circles. Beside her, Rhiannon's breathing was steady. Her sister had always been better at confined spaces, some gift of temperament or wiring that let her shut down claustrophobia through pure willpower. Kaelen focused on breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth, staying calm. This was temporary. Uncomfortable, but temporary. The truck stopped. Voices outside, multiple voices, speaking in official tones. Kaelen's linguistic skills weren't good enough to catch every word, but she recognized the cadence. Security forces, checkpoint guards, people with authority and suspicion. The metallic tang of fear returned to Kaelen's mouth. The truck's engine shut off. Someone climbed onto the truck bed. Footsteps moved along the containers. The harsh sound of panels being opened, cargo being inspected. The search was thorough. Kaelen's hand found Rhiannon's in the darkness. Squeezed once. Rhiannon squeezed back. Whatever happened now, happened together. The footsteps came closer, stopped right above their hidden compartment. Kaelen held her breath, certain the panel would be ripped open, certain this was the end of their journey. The footsteps moved on. More sounds, more inspection. Voices raised in question, answered by the driver in tones of bored routine. This happened every crossing. The guards searched because that was their job. The driver tolerated it because that was his. After 30 minutes, the engine restarted. The truck resumed motion. They had passed through the checkpoint. Kaelen exhaled slowly, relief flooding through her, making her muscles tremble. Rhiannon's hand was still holding hers. Neither let go for the next hour. When the panel finally opened, daylight stabbed into the compartment like knives. Kaelen squinted against the brightness, her muscles cramped and aching from hours of immobility. The driver's face appeared in the opening. "Across border, 1 hour to city, then you are not my problem." He closed the panel again, but looser this time. Air and light filtered through the gaps. Kaelen could see Rhiannon now, could see the exhaustion and determination etched into her sister's face. "Almost there," Rhiannon whispered, her voice hoarse. "Almost," Kaelen agreed. The truck continued for another hour, then stopped in what sounded like a busy street. The panel opened fully. They climbed out, stiff and aching, into afternoon sunlight and city noise. The driver pointed down the street. "Embassy District, 4 blocks. You walk from here." He didn't wait for thanks. The panel closed, the truck pulled away, and Kaelen and Rhiannon were left standing on a street corner in a foreign city, carrying rifles and wearing clothing that marked them as military, even without insignia. They had to move fast. Drawing attention here was dangerous. They found an alley, stripped off their outer tactical gear, buried it in a dumpster. Underneath, they wore civilian clothes, wrinkled and dirty from days of travel, but unremarkable. The rifles went into hiking bags, broken down into components that wouldn't be immediately recognizable. Then they walked toward the Embassy District. 4 blocks became 8 because they took an indirect route, checking for surveillance, ensuring they weren't being followed. By the time they reached the embassy gates, it was nearly dusk. The Marines on guard duty looked them over with professional suspicion. 2 exhausted women carrying heavy bags, approaching right before closing time. "We're American citizens," Kaelen said, her voice clear despite the dryness in her throat. "We need to speak with someone." "It's urgent." "Nature of your business?" The guard's gaze was sharp, probing. Kaelen glanced at Rhiannon. This was it. Once they said the words, there was no taking them back. "We're United States Marines," Kaelen said, the words feeling both foreign and profoundly right. "And we need to report an incident." The guard's posture shifted, a subtle tightening of his stance. "Do you have identification?" Kaelen pulled out her military ID. It was battered from 2 weeks of hard travel, but readable. Rhiannon did the same. The senior guard spoke into his radio. Within minutes, an embassy official appeared, a woman in her 50s, dressed professionally, radiating competence and no-nonsense authority. "I'm Margaret Chen, Deputy Chief of Mission. The guards say you're Marines." "Yes, ma'am." "Captain Kaelen Stone and Lieutenant Rhiannon Stone. We need to speak with the defense attaché immediately." Chen studied them, her gaze lingering on their tired faces. "You're not on any embassy roster. Where's your unit?" "That's what we need to discuss with the attaché, privately." Chen made a decision. "Come with me." They were escorted into the embassy compound, through security screening, into a conference room, where they waited under the watchful eyes of more guards. Neither Kaelen nor Rhiannon was armed. The guards had confiscated their rifles, politely but firmly. After 20 minutes, a man in a Navy uniform entered, commander rank insignia, defense attaché, or someone close to it.
"I'm Commander David Price. I understand you have information about an incident."
Kaelen took a breath. Here was the moment. The point where they stopped being fugitives and became something else. Whistleblowers, maybe, or heroes, or criminals, depending on who was listening. 2 weeks ago, 3rd Battalion Marine Regiment was ambushed in a valley approximately 200 miles north of here. Command issued Omega Protocol, ordered all support elements to withdraw. Lieutenant Stone and I were positioned as sniper overwatch. We disobeyed that order. We remained in position and supported the battalion until reinforcements arrived. The battalion survived. We believe we would face court-martial for our actions. Price's expression didn't change. "Omega Protocol is classified. How do you know about it?" "Because we received the order, and because we broke it." "Can you prove your claims?" Kaelen pulled out a small notebook from her jacket. Every entry she had made during their mission.
coordinates, wind readings, shots taken, times, distances. A complete tactical log of everything that had happened on that ridgeline. Ballistics will match our rifles. Shell casings are still at the positions. The Marines in that valley can confirm someone provided sniper support, and Command knows 2 snipers went dark exactly when Omega Protocol was issued. Price took the notebook, scanned a few pages. His expression finally changed, not to anger or approval, but to careful calculation.
You understand what you're alleging? That you disobeyed a direct order during combat operations? Yes, sir. And you understand the potential consequences? Yes, sir. Then why turn yourselves in? You made it across the border. You could have disappeared. Kaelen glanced at Rhiannon. This was the question they had debated during the long nights of travel. Why not just vanish? Why face judgment? Because the truth matters, Kaelen said, her voice firm. Because 1,000 Marines lived, and someone needs to explain why Command was willing to let them die. Because if we disappear, the story gets buried. But if we stand up and tell it, maybe something changes. Price was quiet for a long moment. Then he closed the notebook and looked at both sisters. You're both under military authority as of this moment. You'll be held here pending investigation. I'll need to contact CENTCOM, get guidance on how to proceed. This is complicated. We understand, sir. I'm not sure you do. Price stood. You saved lives. Command will acknowledge that. But you also broke the chain of command during active operations. The military can't function if everyone gets to choose which orders to follow. You've put Command in an impossible position. With respect, sir, Command put itself in that position when it issued Omega Protocol, Rhiannon said. It was the first time she had spoken since entering the embassy. Price gave her a hard look. Then, surprisingly, he almost smiled. That's between you and the Court-Martial Board, Lieutenant. For now, you're both confined to embassy quarters. Marines, escort them to the holding rooms. Kaelen and Rhiannon were led away, separated for the first time in 2 weeks. As the door closed behind her, Kaelen felt the weight of everything they had done settle onto her shoulders. They had made it. They were safe. They would tell their story, and then they would face whatever consequences came next. They held Kaelen in isolation for 3 days, a small room in the embassy basement. Bed, desk, chair, no windows, meals delivered by guards who wouldn't make eye contact. She wasn't technically under arrest, no charges had been filed, but she was definitely in custody. The first interrogation came on day 2. 2 officers from the Inspector General's office, a colonel and a major, both wearing the careful expressions of people conducting an investigation that could become politically explosive. They went through Kaelen's notebook page by page, cross-referenced her statements against satellite data, battle reports, radio transcripts. They asked the same questions multiple ways, looking for contradictions or exaggerations. Kaelen answered everything truthfully. No point in lying. The evidence would either support her or it wouldn't. You claim you shot 47 targets, the major said, his voice flat. That's an extraordinary number for a single engagement. I didn't shoot 47 people. I shot 47 times. How many were effective, I can't confirm. Probably 30, maybe 35. The rest were suppressive fire or shots at equipment. Still, a remarkable performance. My sister probably matched me. We had good positions, and the enemy gave us targets. The colonel leaned forward, his eyes piercing. Why didn't you withdraw when ordered? Because withdrawing meant the battalion would be overrun. Omega Protocol is meant to preserve assets.
We calculated that our presence could preserve more assets than our withdrawal. That's not your calculation to make, Captain. No, sir, but it was the calculation we made anyway. The interviews continued for hours. They took breaks, came back with new questions, probed for inconsistencies. Kaelen answered until her voice was hoarse, then kept answering. On the third day, they brought in Rhiannon. The sisters were kept separated, seated across a table in the same conference room where they had first made their report. Rhiannon looked tired but unbroken. They weren't allowed to speak to each other directly. The officers asked questions, directed answers. Lieutenant Stone, did your sister order you to remain in position? No, sir. We discussed options and came to the same conclusion independently. So, it was a joint decision? Yes, sir. Who turned off their radio first? Rhiannon glanced at Kaelen.
Does that matter? It establishes chain of command and responsibility. We both turned off our radios within seconds of each other. I don't know who was first. I don't care. The colonel made a note, his pen scratching against the paper. You understand that disobeying Omega Protocol is a serious offense. I understand that following Omega Protocol would have been a more serious offense, sir. The interrogation went on. They were looking for something, evidence of conspiracy maybe, or proof of premeditation, some legal angle that would make this easier to prosecute or excuse. Kaelen knew they wouldn't find it. She and Rhiannon had made their decision in the moment, based on the situation in front of them. It wasn't planned. It wasn't malicious. It was just two Marines making the call they thought they had to make. Finally, after 8 hours of questioning, the colonel closed his file. You'll both remain in custody pending command review. A court-martial board is being convened. You'll have access to legal counsel. In the meantime, you're restricted to embassy grounds. Kaelen and Rhiannon were escorted back to their separate rooms. As they passed in the hallway, Kaelen caught her sister's eye. Rhiannon gave the smallest nod. They had done everything they could. Now it was out of their hands. Days passed. Kaelen read, exercised in her small room, thought about everything that had led to this point. She tried not to think about worst-case scenarios. Years in military prison, dishonorable discharge, the end of everything they had worked for. But she couldn't stop thinking about the young Marine in the canyon, whether he had gone home, whether he knew about the sisters on the ridge. On the 7th day, Commander Price returned. You have a visitor, he said, his voice clipped. Not official, not part of the investigation, but someone asked to see you, and I'm allowing it. He led Kaelen to a different conference room. Sitting at the table was a man in his 50s, wearing a Marine uniform with colonel insignia. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp, and something about him was profoundly familiar. Captain Stone, the colonel said. I'm Colonel Thomas Thorne. I commanded 3rd Battalion in the canyon. Kaelen's throat tightened. This was the officer whose Marines she had saved, the one who would have watched his entire command die without intervention. Sit down, Captain. Kaelen sat, the chair scraping against the floor. Colonel Thorne studied her for a long moment. I've been briefed on what you and your sister did. The IG showed me your tactical logs, your fire patterns, your casualty estimates. He paused. You saved my Marines. All of them. And I'm here to tell you, thank you. Kaelen didn't know what to say. Thank you seemed inadequate. Explaining seemed unnecessary. I'm also here to tell you, Thorne continued, his voice grave, that what you did has created a shitstorm at levels above both our pay grades. CENTCOM is furious. The Joint Chiefs are arguing about it. Politicians are asking questions. I understand, sir. I'm not sure you do. Omega Protocol exists for a reason. It's meant to prevent small unit leaders from making tactical decisions that have strategic consequences. You and your sister overrode that protocol. You decided you knew better than command.
Yes, sir, we did.
And you were right. Thorne leaned back, a sigh escaping his lips. My Marines, 1,000 of them, went home because 2 snipers decided to ignore orders. That's not supposed to happen. It's not how the system works, but it's what happened. Sir, are you testifying at the court-martial? That's why I'm here. I've been asked to provide testimony about the tactical situation. About what would have happened without your intervention. About the effectiveness of Omega Protocol in this context. Kaelen waited, her heart pounding. This could go either way. Thorne could testify that they saved lives, or he could testify that they undermined command authority. Both were true. Which truth mattered depended on what the court valued more. I'm going to tell them, Thorne said slowly, his eyes fixed on Kaelen's, that Omega Protocol was the wrong call. That the situation on the ground didn't match the assumptions behind the protocol. That my Marines would have been slaughtered if command's order had been followed. He looked directly at Kaelen. I'm going to tell them that you and your sister demonstrated the kind of tactical judgment that the Corps is supposed to train into its leaders. And that if exercising that judgment means court-martial, then the system is broken. Kaelen felt something unclench in her chest. Not relief. She was still facing charges, still looking at possible prison time. But validation. Someone who had been there, who had commanded the Marines they saved, was willing to stand up and say they had done the right thing. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. This isn't over. There are people in command who want to make an example of you, who believe that discipline matters more than outcomes, who think that letting you walk sets a dangerous precedent. Morrison stood, his uniform crackling softly. But there are also people, myself included, who think the real precedent is punishing Marines for saving lives. We'll see which side wins. He left. Kaelen sat alone in the conference room, processing what she had heard, the taste of dry air in her mouth. The court-martial was coming. The judgment would be rendered. But at least now she knew that someone would speak for them. Someone who mattered, whose voice carried weight, who had been in the canyon when the bullets were flying. It wasn't much, but it was something. The court-martial convened 6 weeks later at Marine Corps Base Quantico. Kaelen and Rhiannon were flown back to the United States under guard. They were processed, assigned legal counsel, given the formal charges: disobeying a direct order in time of combat, operating outside established chain of command, unauthorized engagement with enemy forces. The maximum sentence for each charge was years in confinement. Combined, they could face decades in military prison. Their lawyer was a captain named Jennifer Reeves, a JAG officer with 12 years' experience in military law. She was blunt in their first meeting. The facts aren't in dispute. You disobeyed orders, you broke protocol. Command has documentation of everything. The only question is mitigation. Can we convince the court that your actions were justified under the circumstances? Can we? Kaelen asked, her voice tight. Maybe. The challenge is that the military can't function if everyone gets to decide which orders to follow. The court has to balance your specific situation against the broader principle of discipline. Reeves spread out documents on the table between them. Our best argument is necessity defense, that following orders would have resulted in greater harm than disobeying them. But that requires proving command made the wrong call with Omega Protocol. We have evidence, Rhiannon said. The tactical situation? The casualties that would have resulted? Colonel Thorne's testimony. All of which will be countered by the prosecution arguing that tactical decisions aren't made by captains and lieutenants in the field.
They're made by command, with access to a larger strategic picture.
Reeves looked at both sisters, her gaze grim.
Be prepared for this to get ugly. The Corps is divided on this. Some people see you as heroes. Others see you as a threat to good order and discipline. The trial will become a proxy for that larger debate. The court-martial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented their case methodically. Radio transcripts showing the Omega Protocol order. Testimony from the operations officer who had issued it. Expert witnesses explaining why battlefield commanders can't be allowed to freelance. The most damaging testimony came from a brigadier general who had helped write the protocols. Omega Protocol exists precisely because junior officers in the field don't have the information necessary to make strategic decisions. Captain Stone and Lieutenant Stone believed they were saving lives, but they didn't know what resources were being marshaled for rescue. They didn't know the larger operational picture. They made a decision based on incomplete information and got lucky. Next time, that kind of freelancing could trigger an international incident or compromise a larger operation. Reeves cross-examined aggressively. General, were resources being marshaled for rescue? The situation was being evaluated.
That's not what I asked. Were resources actively being deployed to save 3rd Battalion? The general hesitated, a bead of sweat tracing his temple.
Not at the time Omega Protocol was issued.
So the battalion was being abandoned?
They were being evaluated as acceptable losses in a fluid tactical situation.
Acceptable losses. 1,000 Marines. Acceptable. Reeves let that hang in the courtroom, the silence heavy with the implications. General, if Captain Stone and Lieutenant Stone had followed orders, would those Marines have survived?
That's impossible to determine.
Colonel Thorne determined it. He commanded those Marines. He testified that without sniper support, his battalion would have been overrun by dawn. Do you dispute his assessment? I dispute that Captain Stone and Lieutenant Stone had the authority to make that calculation. The prosecution rested after 10 days. The court had heard extensive testimony about protocol, about chain of command, about the necessity of discipline in military operations. Now it was the defense's turn. Reeves called Colonel Thorne first. He testified for 6 hours, describing the tactical situation in vivid detail. The enemy disposition, the inadequacy of his defensive position, the certainty of annihilation if dawn had come without support. The sniper fire changed everything, Thorne said, his voice ringing with conviction.
The enemy lost command cohesion. They lost initiative. They went from confident attackers to confused defenders. That bought us time until reinforcements arrived. The prosecutor cross-examined. Colonel, do you believe junior officers should be allowed to override command decisions? I believe officers should be trained to exercise judgment. That's what Captain Stone and Lieutenant Stone did. They looked at the situation, made a calculation, and acted accordingly. Even when that action violated direct orders? Thorne paused, his gaze sweeping the courtroom. I would rather be court-martialed for saving lives than decorated for following orders that led to massacre. The courtroom went silent, the weight of his words palpable. Reeves called other witnesses. The young Marine, Kaelen, had watched through her scope, now Corporal Daniel Hayes, 20 years old, alive because 2 women had defied orders. He testified with tears in his eyes, describing the desperate hours of darkness, the certain knowledge that dawn would bring death, and then the impossible sound of sniper fire from the ridgeline. They saved us, Hayes said simply, his voice cracking. I don't understand why that's a crime. The prosecution objected. The court sustained. Hayes's opinion on legality wasn't relevant, but the emotion was. The court-martial board,
5 officers ranging from major to colonel watched Hayes testify. They heard the crack in his voice.
They saw the impact of Kaelen and Rhiannon's decision measured in living, breathing, human terms. Finally, Reeves called Kaelen and Rhiannon themselves. Kaelen testified first. She described her thought process clearly, without apology or false humility. She had weighed options. She had chosen the course of action most likely to preserve life. She had known it violated protocol. She had done it anyway. "Did you consider that your actions might encourage other Marines to disobey orders?" the prosecutor asked during cross-examination. "No, sir." Kaelen's voice was steady. "I considered that following orders would result in 1,000 deaths. That seemed like the more significant consequence." "You put your judgment above command's judgment." "I put the lives of Marines above a protocol that didn't account for the actual situation we faced." The prosecutor pressed harder. Kaelen didn't yield. She had spent 2 weeks running through mountains, 6 weeks preparing for this moment. She knew what she had done and why. She wouldn't pretend otherwise to make the court more comfortable. Rhiannon's testimony was shorter, but equally firm. When asked if she regretted her actions, she answered without hesitation. "No, sir. I'd do it again." The trial concluded. Closing arguments were made. The board retired to deliberate. Kaelen and Rhiannon waited for 3 days. They were kept in separate quarters, but allowed brief contact during meals. Neither spoke much. What was there to say? They had told the truth. They had made their case. Now 5 officers would decide their future. On the 4th day, they were called back to the courtroom. The board had reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread during the trial. Media had picked up the story. Twin sisters court-martialed for saving battalion. Public opinion was divided. Veterans groups were loudly supporting Kaelen and Rhiannon. Military leadership was largely silent, letting the process play out. Kaelen and Rhiannon stood at attention as the board filed in. 5 officers, their faces carefully neutral. The president of the board, a colonel with combat decorations from 3 wars, carried a folder containing the verdict. "The court-martial board has reached findings on all charges," the colonel announced, his voice grave. "The accused will remain standing." Kaelen felt Rhiannon shift slightly beside her. Their shoulders were almost touching. They had faced everything else together. They would face this together too. "On the charge of disobeying a direct order in time of combat, we find the accused..." The colonel paused, letting the weight settle. "Guilty." Kaelen's stomach dropped, a cold, hard knot. She had expected this. The facts were undeniable, but hearing it stated formally still hit hard. "On the charge of operating outside established chain of command, we find the accused guilty." 2 for 2. 1 more charge remaining. "On the charge of unauthorized engagement with enemy forces, we find the accused guilty." 3 guilty verdicts. The maximum sentence now loomed. Years in confinement, dishonorable discharge, the end of their military careers, and possibly their freedom. But the colonel wasn't finished. "This board has considered extensive testimony regarding the circumstances surrounding these violations. We have heard from commanders, from Marines whose lives were preserved, from experts on military protocol and tactical decision-making. We have reviewed the tactical situation in detail and assessed the likely outcomes had the accused followed orders." He looked directly at Kaelen and Rhiannon, his eyes holding a complex mix of judgment and respect. "The board finds that while the accused clearly violated direct orders, they did so in a situation where following those orders would have resulted in catastrophic loss of American lives. We find that their tactical judgment
while outside proper chain of command, was sound and demonstrated the kind of initiative the Marine Corps claims to value in its leaders. Kaelen hardly dared to breathe. This was sounding less like condemnation and more like, therefore, while upholding the guilty verdicts on all charges, this board recommends sentencing at the minimum end of available options. The accused are sentenced to reduction in rank of 1 grade, forfeiture of 1 month's pay, and formal reprimand to be placed in permanent record.
No confinement, no discharge. The courtroom erupted. Spectators talking, reporters scrambling for phones, officers conferring in whispers. The colonel raised his hand for silence. This board further notes that Captain now First Lieutenant Stone and Lieutenant now Second Lieutenant Stone demonstrated extraordinary skill, courage, and tactical judgment under pressure. While we cannot endorse violation of protocol, we acknowledge that rigid adherence to protocol in this instance would have resulted in unacceptable casualties. This court-martial should serve as impetus for review of Omega Protocol and similar doctrines to ensure they account for the kind of tactical flexibility demonstrated by the accused. He closed the folder, the soft click echoing in the now hushed room. This court-martial is concluded. The accused are released from custody and returned to duty status pending administrative processing of these findings. The gavel fell. Kaelen and Rhiannon remained at attention for a moment, processing. They were guilty. They had been convicted, but they weren't going to prison. They weren't being discharged. They had been demoted and reprimanded, but they were still Marines. Captain Reeves was smiling, a wide, relieved grin. That's about as good as we could have hoped for. The board threaded a perfect needle, upheld discipline while acknowledging you saved lives. Colonel Thorne appeared from the gallery, his face unreadable. Congratulations. You're officially criminals with commendations. Sir? Kaelen wasn't sure she had heard right. The board included a commendation in your files. You'll have both a formal reprimand and a formal commendation. Future commanders will have to decide which matters more. He shook both their hands, his grip firm. I've already decided. If either of you want a position in my command, you've got it. Rhiannon laughed, the first genuine laugh Kaelen had heard from her in months. Are you sure you want snipers who don't follow orders? I want snipers who know when orders are wrong and have the courage to act accordingly. That's different than not following orders. Thorne smiled. Think about it. No rush. He left. Other people approached. Marines from 3rd Battalion who had attended the trial, officers who wanted to shake their hands, even a few reporters who got past security. Through it all, Kaelen and Rhiannon stood together, still processing what had happened. They had been convicted, punished. Their careers would always carry the mark of this court-martial. Future promotions would be harder. Some doors would close. But they had survived. They had told their story. And most importantly, 1,000 Marines had gone home because 2 sisters decided that some principles mattered more than protocol. As the courtroom cleared, Kaelen looked at Rhiannon. You okay? Yeah. You? Yeah. They didn't need to say more. They had made their choice on a frozen ridgeline at dawn. They had faced consequences. They had accepted judgment. And they would live with the results, whatever those turned out to be. Because some shots were worth taking, even when you knew you'd pay for pulling the trigger. What now? Rhiannon asked, her voice tinged with a new lightness. Kaelen thought about it. They had been through combat, through pursuit, through trial. They had been convicted and vindicated in the same breath. They had lost rank and gained respect. They had broken rules and upheld principles. Now we go back to work, Kaelen said,
a sense of purpose settling deep within her. We're still Marines. We're still snipers. Someone still needs people who can make the hard shots. Rhiannon nodded, a familiar glint in her eyes. Together? Always together. They walked out of the courtroom side by side, twin sisters who had saved a battalion at dawn and paid the price at sunset, ready for whatever came next. Because that's what Marines did. They adapted. They overcame. They moved forward. And sometimes, when the situation demanded it, they ignored protocol and did what was right instead of what was ordered. The story would follow them for the rest of their careers. The Stone sisters, the snipers who defied Omega protocol, the women who chose lives over orders. Some would use it to question their judgment. Others would use it to celebrate their courage. Kaelen didn't care about either interpretation.
She cared that Corporal Daniel Hayes had gone home to his family, that 1,000 Marines had lived to fight another day, that somewhere in the records there was an account of what happened when two women decided that protocol was negotiable, but human life wasn't. That was enough. The rest was just noise. They stepped out into Virginia sunlight, diminished in rank but unbroken in spirit, ready for the next mission. Because the war was never really over. It just took different forms. And somewhere, sometime, there would be another canyon, another battalion, another impossible choice. And if Kaelen and Rhiannon were there, they would make the same decision again. Protocol be damned. Some things were worth fighting for, worth risking everything for, worth standing alone for. And the lives of Marines they would never meet, fighting in valleys they would never see, were worth 2 careers, 2 convictions, 2 women who knew that courage sometimes meant saying no to the people who thought they had all the answers. They had fired their shots at dawn. They had faced judgment at sunset. And they had survived to see another day. That was victory enough.